Our channel shares stories that actually happened. Do you know or have experienced any shocking stories? We also tell the stories of our subscribers. Leave them in the comments so we can share them with the world. We want to hear from you. He never imagined that his life would take such an unexpected and painful turn. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it seemed to be at the time. He was sitting alone at Los Angeles International Airport, anxiously waiting for his mother. It had been a long wait already, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The airport was bustling with people, and the constant sound of rolling suitcases and the chatter of travelers created a strange contrast with the growing unease inside him. His mother had left him there, saying she would only be gone for a few minutes to buy their tickets. "Stay here, don't go anywhere," she had said with a reassuring smile as she walked away. He trusted her completely after all. She was his mother. But as the minutes passed, the excitement of their trip to a beautiful place, a paradise he had imagined in his head, began to turn into something else entirely. The clock ticked on, and his heart began to beat faster. She hadn't come back. He tried not to let his worry show, telling himself that maybe something was just taking longer than expected. But the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. He looked at his watch, then at the crowd, then back to the door. She still wasn't there. His mind started to race. Why wasn't she back? What was taking so long? After what felt like an eternity, he decided to get up and find her. He made his way through the busy terminal, hoping to catch sight of her. He couldn't understand why no one else seemed to be noticing the same thing that was happening to him. His mother was supposed to come back, but she wasn't. He rushed to the ticket counter, the place where he was sure she had gone to buy the tickets. But when he got there, she wasn't in sight. The staff at the counter didn't know where she was. They asked him what she looked like, and when he described her, they only gave him a blank stare. He couldn't help but feel that something was terribly wrong. He wasn't sure what, but he could feel it deep in his chest. The pit in his stomach grew larger as he realized that no one seemed to know where his mother had gone. He was starting to feel completely alone. The hours continued to pass, and with each one his hope began to diminish. At first he had believed that she would come back at any moment. Surely, she was just delayed by something, a problem with the tickets, or maybe some confusion at the counter. But as time went on, he realized he was alone, surrounded by strangers who didn't seem to care about him. The crowd moved around him, rushing to catch their flights or make their connections, while he stood still, waiting for something that never came. No one stopped to ask if he was okay. No one seemed to notice him sitting there on the bench, nervously tapping his foot, biting his lip. He had tried everything he could think of to find her. He asked airport staff again. He ran through the terminal, looking for any sign of her. But all his efforts led to dead ends. His stomach growled, but he couldn't bring himself to eat. What if she came back while he was distracted? What if she was looking for him too? But after hours of searching, he felt his hope starting to slip away. The airport was a cold, intimidating place, and as the day turned into evening, the once bustling terminal began to quiet down. It wasn't just his mother that had disappeared. He felt like he had disappeared too. There were moments when he felt invisible, like the world had moved on without him. The people who passed by didn't notice the boy who had been sitting at the same spot for hours. They didn't notice his growing anxiety, the trembling hands, the tears he was too scared to let fall. At some point, he gave up on the idea that his mother would come back to him. He was alone, truly alone, and that realization hit him hard. He was a child, lost in a sea of people who didn't care, in a place that seemed to have no sympathy for a frightened little boy. As the hours dragged on, he realized he had no choice but to stay put, hoping that somehow she would find him again. But deep down, he knew it was futile. She wasn't coming back. He was forgotten. The night came, and with it, a coldness that seeped deep into his bones. He had no coat, no blanket, and nowhere to go. The lights of the airport, which once felt warm and reassuring, now seemed cold and distant. He couldn't sleep. Every time he tried to close his eyes, his thoughts raced. The sounds of rolling suitcases and distant announcements became a blur, drowning out his own heartbeat. He sat huddled in a corner, clutching his small backpack to his chest. The world around him seemed to keep moving, but he felt like he had been left behind, stuck in a never-ending cycle of waiting, hoping, and realizing that no one cared. By the time the next morning came, he was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. His stomach ached with hunger, but he hadn't had the courage to ask anyone for help. The thought of begging for food was too humiliating, so he waited, hoping his mother would still appear, but with each passing hour that hope became more and more like a distant memory. He wandered through the airport, trying to find something to fill the emptiness inside him, but it was no use. Everything was so overwhelming and yet so empty, he didn't know what to do anymore. He was just a kid, lost in a sea of strangers with no family and no way out. He hadn't eaten in hours, and the thought of food made his stomach twist painfully. He found himself at the food court, standing near the bins, staring at a half-eaten sandwich someone had left behind. His pride told him not to touch it, but his hunger told him otherwise. He hesitated for a long moment before finally reaching for it. The sandwich was cold, but it was food. Shame washed over him as he ate it, but he didn't care anymore. He needed to survive. The moment he took that first bite, tears welled up in his eyes. He had never felt so small, so abandoned. It wasn't just about the food. It was the realization that he had truly become invisible. He wasn't just alone. He was forgotten by the world. The pain in his chest wasn't just physical. It was a deep, gnawing loneliness that he couldn't escape. He ate in silence, sitting next to the trash bin, feeling the weight of his situation settle heavily on his shoulders. He was a lost child, and there seemed to be no one who cared. It had been days, and still no one came looking for him. Sophia had learned how to survive in the harsh environment of the airport. She avoided the eyes of security, finding hidden spots where she could sleep for a few hours without being noticed. She learned when to hide, when to move quickly, and when to stay still. The world had become a place where only the strong survived, and she was beginning to understand that. But the longer she stayed in the airport, the more she realized how much the world had changed for her. She had once been a child filled with excitement, looking forward to a new adventure. But now she was a child running from fear and hunger, trying to stay hidden from the people who could have helped her. There were times when she would sit in the terminal, watching people walk by, feeling like she was just part of the scenery. They didn't see her. They didn't see the fear in her eyes, the bruises of abandonment that no one had noticed. One night, while she was curled up in a corner near the gates, a man approached her. He was tall, his hair tinged with gray, and his eyes held an unsettling warmth. He asked her why she was sleeping in such a place, and for a moment Sophia hesitated. She was scared, but something in his voice made her feel that maybe he could help her. But just as quickly, a warning bell went off in her head. There was something not right about this man. He offered her food, promised her warmth, and said he had a family just like hers. He told her he could take her to a better place, away from the dangers of the airport. But Sophia didn't trust him. Something about the way he spoke made her instincts scream, and she quickly ran away from him. She could feel his eyes on her as she dashed into the men's restroom, locking herself in. The fear that had been growing inside her suddenly intensified, and she realized that she couldn't trust anyone. She was completely alone, and everyone around her seemed either indifferent or ready to take advantage of her. The next few days felt like a blur. She learned how to survive in the shadows, scavenging food when no one was looking, and constantly avoiding the watchful eyes of security and the staff. It felt like a constant game of hide and seek, with no one looking for her, but everyone looking at her as if she didn't belong. She was just a child, and yet she was forced to live a life that no one should ever have to. She had to become invisible to stay safe. But it was getting harder to keep running. The fear, the hunger, and the loneliness weighed on her, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep going. As the days passed, Sophia began to feel like a ghost, drifting through the airport with no real sense of time. Her body was weak, and her mind was starting to fray at the edges. She could hear the murmurs of the passengers around her, see the flashing lights of the flight boards, but none of it felt real anymore. She had become part of the background, nothing more than a faint memory in a place full of transitory faces. It was around the 5th day that she met someone who would change everything. It was a security guard who noticed her. His name was Samuel, and for the first time, someone looked at her with concern instead of indifference. She had been hiding in a corner near the bathroom, trying to gather the energy to keep moving when he approached her. He told her to get up, said she couldn't stay there, and for a moment, she thought he was going to make her leave the airport. But instead, he grabbed her by the arm, pulling her towards the security office. She felt the heat of his grip, but it wasn't the kind of warmth that made her feel safe. It was the kind of warmth that felt like it was trapping her. When they reached the security office, he looked at her, his eyes cold, and asked what she was doing there. For a moment, Sophia couldn't answer. She had no words. What was she supposed to say? "I'm waiting for my mom," she said softly, but even she knew that wasn't the truth anymore. He didn't buy it. He told her to stop lying, that she had been there long enough, and that the airport couldn't take care of lost children. Sophia tried to speak, to explain that she hadn't been abandoned, that her mother would come back, but the words stuck in her throat. Samuel wasn't listening. He was just doing his job, like everyone else. When he let go of her arm, Sophia had never felt so small. She realized that no one in the world cared for her, not really. They saw her as a problem, something to be removed, something that didn't belong. She had always been invisible, but now it felt like she was being erased. The humiliation of that moment stayed with her, but something else happened too. She didn't give up. She couldn't. Somehow, in that moment, when Samuel had almost discarded her, she found something in herself, a flicker of defiance. She knew she couldn't let him take her away. So, she ran. She didn't think about where she was going, only that she had to get away from him, from all of them. She darted through the airport, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't stop until she reached the farthest corner of the terminal, out of sight. She was shaking, but something inside her had changed. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't going to let them forget her. She was going to survive, even if no one cared. Sophia's world had become a constant cycle of hiding and surviving. She had learned how to move like a shadow, slipping through the cracks of the airport, unnoticed and invisible to everyone except those who might pose a threat. She lived in fear, never fully trusting anyone, and for good reason. Every time she thought she had found a safe spot, she'd hear a voice or see a pair of eyes that would make her heart race with panic. She couldn't let her guard down. For days, she moved through the airport like a ghost, scavenging food when no one was looking, finding places to hide when security was near. It wasn't much of a life, but it was all she had. And then one night, something unexpected happened. She was sleeping in a corner near Gate 8, curled up against the cold, hard floor, when she felt someone touch her shoulder. Her heart stopped. She jerked awake, her breath shallow, her body tense. She looked up to see a man standing over her. He was tall, with dark hair and a stern expression. She froze, unable to move. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice low but not unkind. "What are you doing here?" Sophia was terrified. She didn't know what to do. This man, like the others before him, could be someone dangerous, someone who would hurt her. She instinctively shrank back, but he stepped closer, not in a threatening way, but with a kind of curiosity that made her pause. "I'm just waiting for my mom," she whispered, her voice shaky. He looked at her with a mixture of sympathy and confusion, but then, as if he understood, he softened. "You shouldn't be sleeping here," he said. "It's not safe for you. Come with me. I have food and you can stay with my family. I have a son your age. You won't be alone." Sophia felt something stir inside her. It wasn't trust, not exactly, but there was something about this man that didn't seem dangerous. She hesitated. She was scared, but the offer of food, warmth, and comfort felt too tempting to ignore. But as she looked into his eyes, something told her to be careful. She had learned the hard way to never trust anyone too quickly. "No, thank you," she said, pulling away from him. "I'm waiting for my mom. She'll be back soon." The man didn't seem offended. He just nodded, and after a brief moment of silence, took a step back. "All right, kid. But be careful. The airport isn't a safe place for someone your age." Sophia watched him walk away, her heart still pounding. She knew she had made the right choice. She couldn't afford to trust anyone, not even if they seemed kind. That night, as she lay back down on the cold floor, she realized that she couldn't let her guard down. Not ever again. She was on her own, and the world was a dangerous place. But she was still alive, and that meant she could keep fighting. Sophia's life in the airport continued in the same routine for weeks. She learned to become an expert at blending in, moving unnoticed through the crowds, always aware of the security officers and airport staff. But despite her precautions, things started to change. It wasn't just the constant feeling of fear and exhaustion weighing on her anymore. She had begun to feel a strange sense of loneliness, a kind of isolation she couldn't escape, even in a crowded place like the airport. She longed for human connection, for someone to talk to help her feel like she mattered. It wasn't much to ask for, just a kind word, a gentle touch. But she knew that wasn't going to happen. After all, no one even saw her anymore, not truly. Then, one day, just as the day was fading into evening, Sophia found herself in the food court, looking at the food from a distance. She hadn't eaten properly in days. Her stomach ached with hunger, but the shame of asking for food from strangers kept her rooted to the spot. She was just about to turn and leave when she heard a voice. It wasn't harsh or demanding, but soft and gentle, almost familiar. "Hey, are you all right?" She turned to find a woman standing there looking at her with an expression of concern. This wasn't someone who looked at her with disdain or as if she was a problem. The woman's gaze was warm, caring, almost as if she had been waiting for her to show up. For a moment, Sophia froze. Who was this woman? Why was she speaking to her? What did she want? But the woman didn't seem to be threatening in any way. I'm fine," Sophia stammered, trying to play it cool, but she could feel her voice tremble. The woman nodded, understanding, and smiled gently. "You don't have to be fine all the time, you know. I see you here all the time. I'm Margaret. If you're hungry, I have some extra food." Sophia hesitated, but the hunger gnawing at her belly was stronger than her fear. She didn't answer immediately, but her eyes betrayed her. "I don't want to be a bother," she said, still unsure if she could trust this woman. Margaret smiled again, her eyes soft with kindness. "You're not a bother, sweetheart. Everyone deserves to eat." And just like that, the ice cracked. Sophia felt a warmth inside her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She took the food from Margaret, and for the first time in weeks, she ate without feeling ashamed. Margaret didn't make her feel small or invisible. She treated her like a human being, like someone who deserved help. The kindness, so rare in the cold, indifferent world Sophia had been living in, made something shift inside her. She had never been shown care like this, not since her mother left her at the airport. For that brief moment, Sophia wasn't invisible. She wasn't the abandoned child. She was just a girl who had been given a chance, even if only for a few minutes. As she ate, she realized something. Maybe there was still hope. Maybe the world wasn't as cruel as it seemed. After that day, Sophia couldn't stop thinking about Margaret. The woman had shown her kindness in a way she had never experienced before. It wasn't just the food. It was the way Margaret treated her like a real person, not someone to be ignored or avoided. For the first time since her mother left, Sophia began to feel like there was a way out of this nightmare, a way to escape the prison of the airport. But even as she felt a spark of hope, her past refused to let go. Anthony, the man who had approached her before, continued to haunt her thoughts. He had been persistent, always lurking in the background, watching her every move. His words echoed in her mind, always trying to lure her back to a life she knew would destroy her. She could still feel his gaze, cold and calculating, as if he could see right through her. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was a deep sense of dread, a certainty that he would come for her if she ever let her guard down. Sophia knew she couldn't stay in the airport forever. She couldn't keep hiding, hoping to go unnoticed. Margaret's kindness had given her a taste of what it might be like to live a different life, one where she wasn't running or hiding every minute of every day. But the fear of being caught, of being dragged back into the hands of someone like Anthony, was still too strong. The airport had become her world, and stepping outside of it felt like stepping into the unknown. But as much as she was afraid of the world beyond the airport walls, Sophia knew she couldn't live in this prison any longer. She had to find a way out. One day, Margaret found her again, sitting alone in a corner, watching the people walk by. "You know, you don't have to be alone in this," Margaret said, her voice gentle. Sophia looked up at her, and for the first time she realized that maybe she didn't have to be alone. Maybe there were people out there who cared enough to help her. "What do you mean?" Sophia asked, still unsure. "I've been working with a charity that helps kids like you," Margaret explained, her eyes soft. "There's a place you can go, a shelter for kids who need help. It's not perfect, but it's safe, and you won't have to hide anymore." The words felt like a lifeline, something Sophia had longed for but never believed she could reach. A place where she could be safe, where she wouldn't have to keep running. She didn't know what to say at first. Part of her was still scared of what might happen if she trusted someone again. But as she looked at Margaret, she realized that maybe it was time to take that step. Maybe it was time to trust again. "Okay," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'll go." It was the first time in weeks that she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least now, she wasn't facing it alone. The decision to leave the airport was one of the hardest things Sophia had ever done. Leaving the only place she had known for so long, even though it had become a prison, was terrifying. She was so used to being invisible, to blending into the background, that stepping into a new world felt overwhelming. As she walked with Margaret toward the car, the familiar sight of the airport behind her, Sophia felt a mixture of fear and excitement. She didn't know what awaited her, but she was no longer running from her past. She was stepping into a future, a chance to rebuild her life. When they arrived at the shelter, Sophia was hesitant. The building was small, but there was something about it that felt different. It wasn't the cold, indifferent atmosphere of the airport. It was warm, inviting. Inside, there were other kids who were laughing, playing, and simply being kids. Sophia stood at the door, unsure of what to do. She had spent so long being alone, so long hiding, that she didn't know how to interact with others anymore. But Margaret reassured her. "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," she said softly. "You're safe here, and you can take things at your own pace." Sophia nodded, still feeling the weight of everything she had been through. But something inside her shifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt like she could breathe. She didn't have to run. She didn't have to be invisible anymore. That night, after the other kids had gone to bed, Sophia lay in the soft bed, staring up at the ceiling. She wasn't used to comfort. She wasn't used to feeling safe. But the bed wasn't hard like the airport floor. The blanket wasn't cold and thin. For the first time in so long, Sophia allowed herself to relax, to feel the warmth of hope spreading through her. She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but she knew that she had taken the first step, the step toward a life she never thought was possible. She had been lost for so long, but now she was finally found. Sophia's life in the shelter wasn't perfect, but it was safe. It wasn't the luxury or the comfort she had once dreamed of, but it was real. For the first time in months, she woke up in a place where she felt like she belonged. She had her own bed, food to eat, and people who cared about her. It was hard to get used to the idea that she wasn't alone anymore, that there were people who actually wanted to help her. Slowly, she began to trust again. She attended school, made friends, and for the first time she began to laugh. But even as she moved forward, the memories of the airport, of the fear and the loneliness, stayed with her. They shaped her, made her who she was, but they no longer controlled her. One day, months later, Margaret came to visit her at the shelter. They talked for a long time, and Sophia realized how much she had changed. She was no longer that scared little girl, hiding in corners and hoping someone would notice her. She was strong now, and she had found a new family in the people who cared for her. Sophia never forgot the lessons she learned during those long, lonely days at the airport. They stayed with her, driving her to help others who had been abandoned, lost, or forgotten, just like she had been. And as she moved forward in life, she carried with her the knowledge that, no matter how dark the journey had been, there was always hope. There was always a way out, even when it seemed impossible. It wasn't an easy road, but it was one she had walked, and it had changed her forever. She had survived. She had found her way back to herself.